Hello all, welcome to this module on Application Programming Interfaces, or as they are popularly known, APIs. In this module, we'll be looking at the basics of APIs, look at some of the history behind this and why they became suddenly so popular. We will also be using Python to access some of these APIs. In this module, we'll specifically focus on using APIs to read or retrieve data. Just know that there are many other possibilities, including posting or deleting data. We won't be focusing on them for this module. Okay, we'll specifically be using the API that you see here, an API to access exchange rates. We will be looking at some of the excellent APIs provided by New York Times. And I will also be pointing you to some of these other APIs, OMDB, Yelp, and Twitter, and give you pointers in terms of how you can go out and try to access these and many other APIs that are out there for your needs. Okay, now let's talk a bit about the basics of APIs. The history behind these APIs, the specific idea goes back a long way. People in the early days, 30, 40 years ago, talked about automatically connecting different applications, enterprise strength applications, either locally or remotely, right? Using these APIs. The basic idea is that you have kind of a black box where you send in a request and you get back a response to this request. This is a specific example for this kind of APIs over the web, but this idea have been talked about way before the web. There were no standards 30 years ago. People talked about coming up with specific standards. And this example, this actually uses a remote API because the client is sending in a request over the network, over the cloud, someplace else, right? And that request is fulfilled, from a remote location. Okay. Of course, APIs can also be local. Think about the example that we've looked at in the past several modules. If you think about using Python programming language and some of the data types, think about string data type, list data type. Maybe you called on a method to manipulate a variable. For example, think about the upper data type for string that basically takes in a string value and converts everything you pass in to uppercase letters, right? And what you were doing so far is pretty much local because you had the Python programming language installed on your computer, right? And when you're writing code, you passed in a request to do something. In this case, convert the string to uppercase or sort the elements of a list. And so that's the idea behind local APIs. You've been dealing with them. You didn't really realize that you've been dealing with it. And of course, you can also have more complicated possibilities when it comes to remote APIs. Okay, so there are lots of different possibilities. In this module, we'll specifically focus on web-based APIs, right? And I'm going to just say this, using REST is representational straight transfer. You don't have to really know what it is, but don't be flustered if someone says, hey, I'm using RESTful APIs. It's just another fancy way for them to say, hey, I just requested some data over the web, right? Let's say I went to Twitter and I'm looking at the tweets that were recently posted on pizza in New York, right? So they're using web-based APIs. It's basically most likely using REST API. Not always, but most likely using RESTful APIs. Okay, but we will be focusing mostly on this specific example, web-based APIs using REST, and we'll talk more about this a bit later when we talk about these examples. Okay, and again, as I mentioned, we'll be specifically reading data. Okay, there are other possibilities that we are not going to be looking at, and that specifically corresponds to this GET request over the web, right? If you look at this picture here, we'll be looking specifically at the GET request. Okay, in fact, anytime you go online and you type in a web page www.abc.com, you are sending in a GET request for the home page of that particular website. You're sending in a URL, right? And you're asking for the home page of that particular resource, right? And so that's the GET request. There are other possibilities like posting some data to the server, or creating something new, creating a new record, or even deleting something on the other side. Those possibilities exist, especially when you talk about Twitter, right? I might refer briefly to those possibilities. For example, can you use an API to post a tweet? Of course, it's possible. It's very easy. Okay, but for most of this module, we'll only be focusing on the specific request called GET The purpose is to read data provided by resources over the web, like New York Times, Twitter, Yelp, and so on. Okay, but other possibilities exist. I'll point you to the right locations, and if you want to do more, you can always try to think about it and do this on your own. Okay, and we'll be doing this using endpoints. It's again another fancy way of saying I'll be specifying a web URL, because all of this is going to be happening over the web. I'm typing in HTTP and I'm giving in a web URL, right, where I'm sending in this request. That's all it means. And sometimes people might use this term called endpoints. They might also talk about parameters. This is basically another way of saying when I put in the URL, maybe at the very end of the URL, sometimes you might see parameters being passed. Like if you look at YouTube video, for example, sometimes you might have a question mark t equal to, let's say, 300 seconds. It simply means that point to 300-second mark in that video, right? So I might pass in some parameters as well. Okay, so what I'm sending in, imagine this as me sending in a URL, a web resource, so that I can get, right, some information from the server on the other side. Okay, so that I can read in data. That's our focus. We'll be using web-based APIs, and sometimes, right, depending on the example, we may need authentication, because they may not, on the other side, the server may not let you access any of the data unless you provide a proper authentication. Like in this case, maybe it could be a user password combination, could be an API key, and then it can also get more complicated. For Twitter, it's slightly more complicated. I'll point you to also these different possibilities. But the idea here is that maybe you need authentication. In some rare examples, you don't need authentication. Like we'll be looking at a simple example later in this module. We'll be looking at exchange rates. We don't need authentication, but typically you would need an authentication to be able to access resources over the web. Okay, and I'll also point you to how to do that. And when you send in the request for that resource, the response typically comes back. There are multiple possibilities, including XML, but typically they will almost always provide a JSON formatted data, right? And we will be dealing with JSON formatted data. Okay, and so this is what we'll be doing: reading data, sending in a request and reading data in JSON format for this module. Okay, and again, zooming back out again, as I mentioned, we'll be looking at RESTful APIs, another fancy way of saying web-based APIs. Okay, there are other standards out there, older standards like SOAP, which people still argue is probably better for enterprise situations. They exist, they're there. So when you think about APIs, don't just think about the APIs we are talking about in this module. There are other possibilities. And then there's a newer version called GraphQL. But RESTful APIs are so popular that when people think about web-based APIs today, they think about RESTful APIs. And because of the popularity, we will be dealing with RESTful API. Okay, in this module. As I mentioned, there are lots of possibilities: creating data, reading data, updating data, and deleting data. For this module, we'll mostly be looking at reading data. Okay, and in terms of when to use APIs, right? Even though you don't always realize this, APIs really make possible very interesting applications you see out there today. Just think about applications like Alexa or Siri voice recognition or voice assistant, right? If I had a Fire Stick, which is Amazon's the video player option, I may have a remote control, which is not really powerful. I speak into the remote control, Alexa, do something, but the information is transmitted over the cloud to Amazon's web servers, and it's basically doing some voice recognition behind the scenes. So all of that is possible because I can now, using APIs, remote APIs, access the computational power and storage over the cloud. Because to do some of these things, the remote control has no storage. And even if you use a mobile phone for many of the applications, it may not have enough storage for all of these applications. So it makes sense for the power, computational power, and the storage to be someplace else over the cloud, and you send in a request and everything gets processed over the cloud and the response comes back over the web. Interesting applications like this would not be possible without these kinds of APIs, especially web APIs. Okay, and APIs, they are also helpful when data is constantly changing. If you're only interested in, let's say, reading data, why not just download them as an CSV or Excel format? Maybe data is constantly changing. So it's easier for these companies to provide let's say things like tweets or Instagram photos, right, over an API rather than over a static Excel worksheet. That's when the data is constantly changing. So again, it might make sense to use the APIs then. Again, this is kind of connected. The last point is connected to the first point somewhat, enterprise level, where I can loosely couple powerful business processes behind the scenes without human intervention. Right? Think about the CRUD operations that I mentioned here, right? Create, read, update, and delete. And again, this is the history, as I talked about 30, 40 years ago, when people talked about how do I enable applications to interact seamlessly without human intervention. You needed something like standards for APIs, right? And they've really taken off in the last 10, 20 years, especially since the advent of web-based APIs, simply because now we have a standard, right? You do have HTTP standard that sits above the internet standard, TCP and IP standard, right? And now all we are doing here is leveraging the existing standards, HTTP standards, and we are sending our requests using the standard and getting a response. And that's why they are ubiquitous. They're very popular. They've really taken off in the last 10, 20 years. Okay. And for us, how do we use APIs, right? Typically, they're pretty easy, believe it or not. I mean, I've been giving you the history and some of the powerful reasons why they're interesting, right? But using them for us, especially to read data, is pretty simple. Okay. We have all the tools we need to actually do that, right? Search for this. How are there APIs for finding exchange rates? Okay. And then once you find that API, you look at the documentation, right? Documentation typically has a description of what the API allows you to do, right? So you should read it carefully. And then it also specifies the requirements. It tells you whether it's paid or it's free. In the old days, 10, 15 years ago, a lot of the APIs used to be free. So many of them now are not available for free because it does cost something, right, to provide access to this data. So it has to make sense for these companies to provide you with a free version, right? So it could be paid or free. But even if it's paid, there might be rate limits. They might restrict in terms of how many requests you can send an hour, or how much you can download an hour, something like that. They could have rate limits, and they might also require you to authenticate yourself. So the documentation will specify these kinds of requirements, so you can look through them. Okay. And they will also provide specific examples, like assuming that, let's say, if there's a free version, they'll tell you, okay, hey, if you want data, here is how you will access this data. So it's you pretty much will have everything you need in the documentation once you know what to do. Okay. And so here's an example of a web page or a web service called exchangeratesAPI.io, right? That provides a very simple service, some of which is free, a lot of it is paid, but we're going to focus on the free part. So please do not provide your credit card number to any of these services. Okay. So one of the things about using these services is that oftentimes the services they provide and how we access them can keep changing. And so in this example, until recently, you did not need any authentication to get the data out. And so I used a code that looked like this, very simple code, where I did not need to tell the service who I am. I didn't need to authenticate myself. I just basically specify an API endpoint, right? And it'll give me the latest exchange rates. And it was as simple as me basically stringing together these 4 lines of code as well as importing relevant packages. Okay. But if I try that now, I'm just going to show this to you. I will probably get an error message, and you can see here that there's an error message where it says that the request I made is not serviced simply because I'm missing an access key. So what you need to do in this example is basically now go back to the documentation, basically click on get free API key here. So if you click through this, you see that you have different tiers of service, free service, basic, professional, and so on. And clearly we are going to be focusing on the free tier. So just click on sign up and fill in the requested information. You shouldn't need to provide credit card information to get access to this free service. Okay. So I'm just going to switch back here, go back to documentation. I'm going to assume that signed up for access and got a free API key. So once you sign in, you should be able to go to a page called dashboard, where you can see your actual API key, right? I'm not going to do that here because I don't want you to see my API key, but please complete that process and then sign in, go to dashboard and make sure that you see your API key, okay? That's what you're going to need to make this code work so that you can make this error message go away, and by making simple modification here, okay? So I'm just going to clear out this error message, and so you will notice that if you go back to the documentation, the way to obtain this information, the latest codes, is basically specify this endpoint, right? So that's what I'm doing here in the new code that I'm trying to write, right? So what I am doing here is I specify the endpoint, okay? And just like documentation is asking me to provide this access key, so what it means is that at the end of this endpoint, you need to basically put a question mark, access key equal to your API key. It'll be a combination of letters and numbers, okay? So I'm going to pause the video here for a second, paste my API key, run the code, and then I'm going to show you the results, okay? So as I mentioned, I added my API key here, ran the code again, and you see that I'm able to get some data. Okay, now before we look at the data, I just want to explain the code that I have here. Okay, so and obviously uncomment, so you need to remove this, uncomment this so that you can run code. Okay, so what's happening here is we are using two different packages. One is request package that you should already be familiar with. The second package is JSON, which is important if you're dealing with APIs. Okay, so I'm specifying my endpoint here, right? Assigning it to a variable called URL underscore key, and I'm basically taking that variable name and I'm putting it here. This is the input that's going into the get method of the request package. Again, you should remember how the request package works. I'm specifying an endpoint, in this case a URL over the web, right? That's going to get me some information from this service, right? Exchange rates API, and then assign this to a variable, okay? And in this case, as you know, it's what's coming back is basically an object from requests, and to get some useful data out of it, I need to basically say dot text. In the case of web scraping, for example, we did this and we got back HTML code as a string, okay? Here, because we are dealing with APIs, it's going to give me back not HTML, but rather the data that I'm looking for as a valid JSON string. And if you pay attention here, I just printed this, all right? And you see that it looks like a dictionary structure, right? But I'm saying this is a string. So let's check it out. Am I correct? Is it a string or is it a dictionary? And if I run this code, it's basically telling me it's a string object, right? It's a string data type. So again, the key here is that this service is sending me data, right? And in this case, it's a string, yes, but it's a valid Python data structure. And in this example, it happens to be a dictionary, okay? And later on, we'll also see that the data that we're interested in, which is the exchange rates, this is the key, right? One of the keys in this dictionary, but the value of the dictionary is actually another dictionary, right? So it's a slightly more complicated data structure, right? So one of these keys has as value another dictionary. So you see a dictionary within a dictionary. But we shouldn't forget that what we're getting back from the service is a valid Python structure that is inside a string, okay? So what we need to do is basically remove the strings so that we can just start using the dictionary, okay? Before I do that, okay, I'm going to show this to you in a few minutes, but you do see here that, again, this is something important, the documentation, it tells you that when you use the endpoint, what the response is going to look like, right? And if you look at this, and if you go back to the code and look at it, it's going to look very similar. The first key is success, the second key is timestamp, third key is base. Again, this tells us that this is probably an European service. So whatever exchange rates you're getting is in relationship, is in reference to the euro, not US dollars. Okay, the current date and the rates. Okay, and that's what it's showing you here in a much more reader-friendly way. It says, hey, this is going to be a dictionary structure, and here's your key value pairs, and one of these keys, by the way, will have the information that you're looking for, a whole bunch of currencies. Okay, so reading the documentation again helps you understand what you need to do to get the data and how the data is coming back out, and it's going to give you some ideas as to how, if I only wanted, let's say, 2 or 3 currencies, what do you need to do to get only these 3 things and ignore everything else. Okay, so again, that's what we're going to talk about in a few minutes. Okay, and before we talk about how we would be taking this string encoded valid dictionary into an actual dictionary in Python, instead of inputting my API key directly in the endpoint, which I don't think is elegant, it's definitely not secure. All right, so what I do is, instead of doing that, hard coding it in the URL, I basically have a endpoint, right? Here I probably need to make a change. And if you go back to the documentation, you see that the endpoint is this, okay? V1 latest. This is the base URL, and then the endpoint is I want the latest rates, and here's my endpoint. In the URL, I'm going to specify because that's what the documentation is telling me to do. Okay. Now what's missing is, I'm going to go scroll back here again, right? What's missing here is the question mark, right? It's basically saying, wait, after this endpoint, here are some of the information I need to pass on to the service. One of this information is my API key, right? You can think of them as parameters I need to pass to the service, okay? And one of the parameters is access key. So again, please remember to use this exact same name. If it's all in lower caps with underscore, you have to use it exactly as it is, access underscore key, okay? And that's what I did here, and that's what I'm going to do here, which is specify this exactly as they tell me. But in this case, I'm going to put them in quotes, and you can also see that I'm enclosing this whole thing in a dictionary structure, and I'm assigning it to a variable name called parameters. So this is a more elegant way of doing things. So at this point in time, what you might want to do is just completely cut this out, remove this, and replace this with your own API key. And you would do that by putting the quotes in there, and then you'll type in a bunch of numbers and letters. It's going to be longer than this, okay? Much longer, but this is what you would do. You would be replacing whatever I had in there with a string that contains your API key, okay? But what you see here is that I don't do that. So I basically, because I don't want you to read or see my API key, what I'm trying to do here is I basically wrote my own module, right? User created module. And we'll talk about this in a different session as to how you would do this. And I basically use a function that I put in that module that basically outputs my key. That's it. So we'll talk about how I do this. How do I do a user created module later on? But for the time being, what you need to do is remove this and replace this with your API key in quotes. Okay, if you want to follow this method, of course, you're free to use this method. It's still going to work. So you either do this, right? Obviously, without this comment, and then directly input that URL here. Okay, or you can use this method, which is I put the API, I put this this API key, right? And I put this inside a dictionary structure, and then I assign it to a variable name called parameters. Okay, and again, the way I do this is I use a user created module, and that's why I need to import that module into this code. Okay, so you won't be doing this, so you need to remove this. If you're not doing this, you need to remove this line, remove this, and replace it with your own API key in quotes because it's a string variable. Okay, and so if you did that, and for me, because this is going to be outputting a string value, this is going to be replaced with my API key that you don't get to see in real time. Okay, and then I have this URL, and then all I need to do is I'm using request package, and this is the beauty of request package. It's more modern. I mentioned this earlier. I like the request package more than the URL lib package, simply because it allows me to specify the parameters separately, right? Instead of putting it all, hard coding it in the URL. So I specify this endpoint, right? And then what needs to come after the question mark, and you see it here, right? What needs to come after the question mark? I basically put them all in parameters, a dictionary structure, okay? In this example, it has only one key with the corresponding value, which is my access key, API key, okay? So let's see if this works. Otherwise, the code is pretty similar to what I have here. JSTR, and then I basically take this request object, and then I use this text attribute to get something from this URL, okay, from the service. So let's go here. Let's run this code to see if this works. Thankfully, it seems to be working, okay? And so now I've shown you two different ways of getting data, right, from the service. Now let's actually look at this variable and see, or let's even look at this object and see how we can access this valid Python dictionary structure, okay? I know it's a dictionary because obviously I can see it. I can also know this by looking at the API response. The documentation should tell you what's coming out, what data is coming out, and how is it coming out, what data structure is this using, okay? So I know it's a dictionary. And so before I can use this as a dictionary to get at the data that I want to get at, specific data points inside the structure, I need to take the string out. I need to basically make sure that this is the valid dictionary structure, because right now it's string data type, as we saw here, okay? So hopefully that's clear. The good news, again, because I'm using, there are multiple ways of me doing it. I think we talked about earlier, if you have a JSON, and if you have the string encoded JSON structure, we can use this method called load s to convert that string to a valid Python data structure. I'm going to show that to you a bit later again in this video. Okay, so I can use this load s method, right, on JSTR to convert a valid Python structure that's encoded in string. So I can use a load s method to convert that into Python data structure. Okay, so I'm going to show it to you later, but there's a much easier way to do this. So instead of saying xrate.text and getting string back, right, I can, if it's a valid Python structure, if what's coming back is a valid Python structure, and you can see here that it's a valid dictionary. So I can directly say, instead of text, say .json. So request package allows you to do it. Remember that xrate is a request object. And so now I can say .json, and it's going to give me the same data, but instead of encoding it in string, right, it's going to be an actual dictionary structure. You're going to get this structure, okay? So let me print JP. Before I do that, maybe I want to show you the data type. So I'm going to say data type. Let's make sure that it is what I'm claiming it to be, okay? Now if I run this, you should see that, hey, it is a dictionary, and it's going to be exactly this, okay? And so let's now that I've shown that it's a dictionary, so let's see if the data is similar to what we have here, in the previous code cell. Yes, it is, right? Again, it's a dictionary with multiple keys and values, and we need to be able to access, let's say, some of these values, the exchange rates somewhere here, okay? So that's what we need. So how can we do that? Obviously, I can use my knowledge in Python to see how can I access different keys, how can I access the values. So here's one example for key in JP. print key. And you know that if I don't specify anything here, if I don't say dot values, right? Or if I don't say dot items or anything like that, by default, if I say this, right? JP is a variable name, it's a dictionary. It's basically going to print all the keys, right? As I mentioned, this is just an iteration variable. I can use any variable name that I want to use. I choose to use key to show that this is actually key that's going to be printed. Okay? And you can see that in this data structure, there are 5 key value pairs, and you get these 5 keys printed out. Okay, so now I know how I can access the keys, and hopefully you know how to access the values as well. Okay, now can you start, here, can you add a code cell here, right? Can you try to find a way to print the value for rates? Think about that. So how would you print this internal dictionary that's right here, right? So think about how you would print just the value. Think about when you're printing the value, what would be the value? What data type would the value be? And hopefully you answered a dictionary, because as you can see clearly after the colon, it's actually a dictionary, right? The value of the key, the value referenced by the key rates is a dictionary data type. So if you just print out the value of rates, you're going to get a value that's a dictionary, right? If you want, you can assign that to another variable, right? You can call it, let's say, rate dt, whatever you want to call it, or something like that. And then let's say that I gave you a problem where I say I want to know the exchange rate of USD, US dollars. It's somewhere in here. So you need to tell me, look up the value of US dollars. What's the exchange rate of US dollars in relation to euro? So again, I want you to think about what do you need to do to just print, right? So think about this. So see if you can print this out on your own without really doing anything past this. Okay. So this is the long way of doing it. Fortunately for us, if you look at the documentation carefully, I'm just going to go down here and I'm going to click through this latest rates, right? This is the endpoint we've been working with, right? It tells me that I can actually specify the base. I can specify, specific values, symbols in this case, the exchange rates I want to look up. Unfortunately for us, we cannot really use this unless we pay. So I'm not going to be using this specific parameter because we have by default access to only the base euro. So by default, if you don't specify it, everything I'm getting back, all the data is going to be euro base, right? If I want to change the base to US dollars, I need to pay up, and we're not going to do that for this session. Okay, so I won't be using this, but you definitely see that I have the ability to, basically just get the currency exchange rates I want. Okay, and that's what we're going to do in the next code cell. Okay, and you can see here, right? Everything is the same. I'm pretty much doing very similar things. The only changes I'm making is basically, in addition to this access key, and again, you can see that I have my package API keys, user defined package. This is the way for me to get my own API key. You need to replace this with your own API key in quotes, right? I don't have to, it's optional. I anyway say base euro, right? You can just try it out, but it should still work without base euro because by default, it's going to be base euro. But this is another parameter I'm specifying, and it will work as long as I have the value as euro. If you say USD, it's going to say, sorry, you need to pay. Okay, you can also try that if you want. And then I'm basically saying, hey, now I want to find the exchange rates for US dollars, Canadian dollars, and pound, British pound in relationship to euro. Okay, so instead of me thinking about basically navigating my way through these, value of the rates and then looking through this to look up US dollars and Canadian dollars and so on and so forth. Instead, I can specify this here because the API allows me to do it. Okay, and again, instead of if you were to follow this original method, it can get quickly out of control. Now you would do another and sign, ampersand sign, then maybe put in your second parameter, specify the value, another and sign, third parameter, specify another value. And you might often have seen this, when maybe you didn't pay attention to this. Sometimes when you're searching for things, do a Google search, you're going to see things like this. This is basically meaning anytime you see a question mark after a valid URL, and you see a whole bunch of variable names and equal to sign and some values, this is what you're doing, right? You're basically passing some parameters. Okay. The request package allows me to do this a lot more elegantly inside a dictionary, right? Again, I'm assigning it to a variable parameters. The only change is I've added additional key value pairs to say that, hey, now I'm adding more constraints, more parameters, passing more parameters with specific values I need to look up. Okay. And I'm using the documentation to figure out how I would pass this information. Okay. And so I do that. Otherwise, everything else is, again, I need to change the URL. So I'm going to go back. I'm just going to copy and paste this because that's a URL. This is, they basically changed this endpoint recently slightly. So I need to make sure that I specify the right URL. Okay. And now, again, it's the same thing. I'm using the request package, get method, specifying the URL. And then I'm saying, hey, it also comes with some parameters, which is a dictionary in a dictionary structure, okay? Which is going to be a string encoded some valid Python dictionary structure. Okay, that's your JSON. So here's where it is, and you can see this a much more, easy to view, right? Data structure, because I'm basically constraining my answers. I'm not interested in everything. I only want this. I still get some stuff that's not necessarily critical, right? Okay. And so again, remember that, think carefully about what data type this value is. Looks like a dictionary, but it's actually string encoded dictionary because I'm using the text attribute there. Okay. So if I wanted to not have the string, if I wanted JSON, I have an option that I showed you, which is directly use .json open bracket close bracket, right? This is what I'm doing here, and this will give me a dictionary. That's one way. The second way, of course, is if you did this and you have a string encoded Python, right? I can basically take that and I can use the load s method. JSON.loadS, a string value, will give you, and it will work as long as you have this string is enclosed by a valid Python structure, and you can see there's a dictionary. It will basically remove the string and give you access to the actual data structure. So if I assign this to a variable name, asked Python what data type it is, it should tell me it's a dictionary, right? And if I don't want to go through all this trouble, I can directly replace this with JSON. xrate.json open bracket close bracket, assign it to a variable name, to check the type, it should be a dictionary. So there are two ways of making sure that I gain access to the valid Python data structure. Okay. Sometimes it's a dictionary. Sometimes it could be a list of some things. So you've got to pay attention to what is coming out. Okay. Sometimes it's a list of dictionaries, maybe. Right. So you got to pay attention to what kind of structure we're getting back. And almost always it's kind of a complicated data structure. And you might want to do some work to gain access to the actual data that you need. Okay. All right. So I got this, right? I can use either. It doesn't really matter. I can either use xrate_jp, right, which is a dictionary, or I can use jp. Both should produce the same results. And as you can see here, I have xrate_jp, right? And I'm basically saying this is a dictionary, open bracket, rates, close square bracket. That should take me right here to this value, to this key value pair, right? And here I'm saying .items. That basically means I can gain access to both the key and the value. Okay, again, there are different ways of doing this. Pay attention, go back to dictionary and take a look at how I can use this, right? But here I'm going to have access to both key and value, right? Which is USD 1.12, CAD 1.42, GBP 0.83, something like that. Okay, so let me run this code. And you can see this is what I got back, right? So I'm getting access to the things I need. Okay, this is a lot more, easier than if I were to think about, if I'm looking at something that's visually very hard to, look at. So thankfully, the API here allows us to specify specific, currencies, so we can keep the complexity more manageable. Okay. Similarly, I'm also showing you that, say, it should be the same answer. JP, open square bracket, rates, close square bracket, items, print X and Y. I should get the same thing. Two different ways of getting at the data, right? And in this example, in this API, it's basically dictionary structure, okay? And it basically gives you the exchange rates. All right. Now, this is a simple example. What I would like you to do is I would like you to go back up here, maybe go back, look at the documentation and see if you can figure out how to make a request to get historical rates. Okay. So again, I've given you the code, but I want to make sure that you make the appropriate adjustments. If you're just not using this user-defined module, and you won't be for this example, remove this, specify your own API key in quotes, and then everything else is the same. The only difference here is it's a different endpoint with the date. Let's say I'm looking for the end of the year, 30th of December 2020. What is the exchange rate on that date? Historical exchange rate. Okay, so that's your new. Again, if you go back to the documentation, you should be able to see that. Specify the date that you want. Okay, and so you have a date, a different endpoint, and make a request and see if you can figure out what comes out and see if you can process the data. You can either convert this to a valid Python dictionary using load_s, or you can remove this and simply type in JSON, open and close parenthesis, to get some data and see if you can make sense of it and see whether you understand what's coming out. Okay, so I'm going to run the code quickly, show that it works, and if it's running, you should see this. Again, if you change the date, obviously the values would change based on the date. This is giving you free access to historical data. The only constraint, unfortunately, for free version, for the free access, you only have access to the base euro, not for any other currency. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful in trying to gain an understanding of how to use Python to get data, right, over the web using valid APIs. Okay, but once you get the fundamentals of how to access data using APIs, you just it should be fairly simple to make that extension and to gain access to data from other APIs. So that brings to an end this module, and I'll see you soon on a different one. Thanks.